Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We will be learning today, hopefully, Daf Kuf Chav Gimel Amid Beis, as well as Daf Kuf Chav Dalet Amid Aleph, which would bring us once again, Baruch Hashem, up to the Dirshu Daf Yomi Bahalacha schedule. So we're holding in Siman Tov Kuf Zayin, and we pick up today two lines from the top of Kuf Chav Gimel Amid Beis with Sif Hey. Says the Mechaber, Tanur v'Kirayim. A tanur and a kira are both different types of ovens that were used in the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, and apparently so too in the times yet somewhat of the Mechaber. One was a larger oven that was made out of earthenware that had room for one pot on top of it. Another one was a larger oven that had room for even two pots on top of it. Tanur v'kirayim chadoshim, says the Mechaber. If you have a brand new tanur or a brand new kira, Ein sachin oisam b'shemen, you're not allowed to smear them with oil. V'loy tashin oisam b'matlis, nor are you allowed to buff and polish them using some kind of cloth. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan chavav. Ein sachin oisam b'shemen, you're not allowed to smear the oven with oil. Shedarkan hayalasach letanurim ba'odan chadashim b'shemen. It was the derech to smear these new ovens when they were brand new with some type of oil, or l'shavshef oisan, and to rub them out and buff them, kedei lahachlikan. This was done in order to smooth out their surface, or l'tzachtzachan, and to shine them. V'aser mishum tikun kli, and this would be aser because of makah b'patish. This is tikun moneh. This is finishing up a keli. Continues the Mechaber, right by the Ois Chav Zayin for the Mishnah Berurah. Aval, however, mutar lahasikan, you are allowed to fire up the oven on Yom Tov, afilu hesek rishon, even if this is the very first time that the oven is being fired up. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Chav Zayin, aval mutar lahasikan, v'loy dami, and this is not comparable, lemalabe neshara ofim, to the case of where somebody heats up a roofing tile. They had these tiles, maybe similar to the Spanish tiles that we have nowadays, that some very fancy houses have. It's an earthenware. It's a tile that's made out of some kind of clay. So we're going to have a case later where somebody fires up one of these tiles and makes it glowing hot, kedei litzlais alehen, so that he could use it as a surface to roast on. Basically, he wants to use it as a griddle. So he takes one of these clay tiles and he fires it up and makes it very hot, and then he throws a fish down on top of it or a piece of meat down on top of it in order to roast it. And we're going to say sha'asr, that's forbidden. Kidla kaman b'siman tavkuf ches sif aleph. And similarly, we also saw another isser. We saw that sometimes to cook in a brand new pot, is forbidden according to many paiskim. We saw this earlier in Tavkuf Beis Dalet. Mishum de mischasemes, and in brackets here, mischazekes. The word mischasemes means that by firing up the tile or by firing up the brand new pot, it actually strengthens it. Belibun, when you fire it up and heat it up to a point where it's glowing. Ubehesik zeh, and when you do that firing up, it makes the keli, it makes the tile or the pot stronger. Ukigomer kli b'yom tov dami. And that would be an act of makah b'patish on Yom Tov, which is aser. So the Chavetz Chaim is pointing out over here that here we seem to have two different we almost have like a contradiction here. We're saying that to fire up a brand new oven, that's okay on Yom Tov. Yet we see that to fire up one of these clay tiles or to fire up a brand new pot, that's usher because it strengthens it. So the Mishnah Berurah wants to know what's the difference between these two cases. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, Tzarech Loimar, you have to say, the tanur, that in the case of the oven, the act of firing up the brand new oven in its interior does not have the effect of strengthening the oven. And that's why it's mutter, as opposed to the tile or the pot is usher. Over there, you're firing it up from the exterior. right? A tile, you're heating it up from its exterior. There is no interior. The pot also, the fire is underneath the pot. So in those two cases, you're actually doing something that's makabeh patish because you're strengthening the keli. But over here by the tanner or the kira, the act of firing it up in its interior does not have that effect of strengthening the tanner or the kira, and therefore it's not an act of makabeh patish. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, v'das Magen Avram. The opinion of the Magen Avram is the tanurim shebizmanenu, that the ovens that we have in our days, but again, he's quoting here the Magen Avram, he's not talking about contemporary ovens, mischas min shaper al yedei hesek rishon va'aser. The Magen Avram wrote that the ovens in his time were strengthened by the act of firing them up for the first time, and therefore it was forbidden. V'yesh cholkin alav, however, there are those who disagree with him. U'kamoisha kasavnu b'sif aleph and sif cotton gimel. Okay, now we continue with the words of the Mechaber. So the Mechaber said, you're allowed to fire up the oven or the kira for the first time. Now says the Mechaber by the Ois Cotton Chav Ches for the Mishnah Berurah, or Bilvad, you're allowed to fire it up. However, what you're not allowed to do, or Bilvad, only shelo yafigem b'tzaynein. You're not allowed to then douse them with cold water kedei lechasman, in order to strengthen them. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, as long as you do not then douse them with cold water, because through the cold water that is thrown onto the oven after it's fired up, while it's still hot, that does strengthen the oven, the Havalei Misakin Moneh, and that would be an act of Misakin Moneh, of Makabeh Patish, and therefore it's usher. Continues the Mishnah Berurah by me, it's 4 lines down from the top by the first word. Ve'im husku yoser midai. Now, how about if you fire up an oven on Yom Tov in order to bake in it or in order to cook with it? Ve'im husku yoser midai. Let's say the oven became overheated, and now if you try to use the oven the way it is, your food is going to become burned. And now you need to douse the oven with cold water. You need to apply some cold water to the oven in order to cool it down so that you should be able to bake in it. Mutter, that is mutter. Explains the Chavetz Chaim. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Eis Katan Chav Tes. You find yourself in a position where you need to pour cold water on the oven in order to cool it down, kedei lefoispem, so that you could bake in it. Shelo yisaref hapas. If you're going to try to use the oven the way it is now in its overheated condition, the bread that you put into the oven is going to burn. So now you want to pour cold water on it, not with the intent of strengthening the oven, but with the intent of cooling down the oven so that you should be able to bake. In that case, the Mechaber said it's mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton limud mutter afal pishem emela mischasem. Even though it just so happens that by pouring the cold water onto the oven, it is going to strengthen the oven, because now the oven was heated up and now you're pouring cold water on it, which we said that does have the effect of strengthening the oven. Less lanba. That doesn't bother us, because that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it as a tzarech eichel nefesh. You're doing it because you need an oven to bake in. So what's the difference if you're making a fire in the oven, which is a malacha? You're allowed to do that. Tzarech eichel nefesh. So now, okay, so now you need to pour cold water on it in order to cool it off. You're doing that l'tzarech eichel nefesh. Yes, it happens to be that the oven will become strengthened through that, which is an act of makabeh patish, but that's not your intent at all. Your intent is you're doing it l'tzarech eichel nefesh in order to cool it down. Now, the Mishnah Berurah again notes that we have almost a seeming contradiction between two halachas, which he will answer. Even though, again, in the case of firing up the roof tile to use it as a roasting griddle, why don't we say the same thing by the tile? By the tile, why are you firing up the tile? You're not firing up the tile in order to strengthen it. You're firing up the tile in order to create a hot griddle, l'tzarech eichel nefesh. So why don't we say the same thing? Why don't we say, just like over here, you're allowed to throw cold water on the oven even though you're going to strengthen it, because you're doing it l'tzarech lechol nefesh, even though the fact is you're going to strengthen the oven, which is an act of makav patish. Why don't we say the same thing by the tile? Yes, it's true, you're firing up the tile and you're doing tikkun moneh because you're strengthening the tile, but that's not your intent. Your intent is l'tzarech lechol nefesh. You're making a nice hot griddle to roast a fish. So how come that's usher and this is mutter? Explains the Chavetz Chaim, Shani Hasam. That case of the roof tile is different because over there, Shetikunai shal ra'afim, the tikkun maneh, the improvement of the tile, hein kaidem latashmish, that comes before your use of the tile l'tzarech lechol nefesh. Sheyishtamish behem achar kach l'tzarech Yom Tov. What you're doing is, you're doing an act of strengthening the tile. You're firing the tile. Now you finish firing the tile, and you actually take the heat away from the tile. Now you go ahead, you take a fish, you have a hot tile, you throw a fish on it in order to roast it. In halacha, we're viewing that as two very independent acts. The first act is you're firing up the tile, which is an act of tikkun maneh. That's something that's asur. Now you have a hot tile, now you're going to use it l'tzarech lechol nefesh, and you're going to throw a fish on it. Aval hacha, but in our case over here of the oven, harei hapas muchan lahanichai betanur. The tanur is a baking implement. That's what it is. You have bread that's ready to go into a baking oven. This is not a baking oven, and you're turning it into a baking oven by firing it up. This is a baking oven, and the truth is, it's not an imperfect baking oven that needs repair. It's not anything else. It's a baking oven that's a little bit too hot. So you pour cold water in it, and then you go ahead and you put the bread in right away in order to bake it. So the bread is ready to go into a ready tanur. Just you need to cool the tanur down a little bit. So you apply some cold water to it. That's called an act of tikkun hapas. That's called something that you're doing for the benefit of the pas. The pas is ready to go into the oven. The oven is a little bit too hot. You need to cool down the oven for the benefit of the pas. That's not what's happening by the fish that you're roasting on the roof tile. By the fish that you're roasting on the roof tile, you need a way to roast a roof tile, to roast a fish. So you come up with a chap, I'm going to take a roof tile and I'm going to fire it up and I'm going to make it nice and hot. After it's nice and hot, I'm going to throw a fish on it. We don't see that as an act that's being done for the fish. We look at that as being two independent acts. V'yesha kasvu, there are those that write the hafagas tzainain enoi oiser rak chisum koldu. There are those that write a slightly different differentiation between these two halachas. And they write that the cooling down of the oven, when you have an oven that you fire up for the first time, and then you throw some cold water on it in order to cool it down, the strengthening that's going to impart into the oven is very minor. And therefore, the Chazal will matter you to do it as long as that's not your intent. Masha'en came by the tile, firing up the roof tile makes a significant improvement in the roof tile. That's actually part of the manufacturing of the roof tile, is to fire it and to make it hot. So that's two very different things. By the oven, it's a slight improvement. It strengthens it somewhat. But by the roof tile, that's a significant change. Now let's go weiter in the Mechaber. The Mechaber says, right by the Ois Katan Lamed Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mechaber, Lefikach, therefore, what's the therefore over here? The same way we see that you're allowed to pour cold water on the oven in order to cool it down so that you could bake in it, even though it's an act of tikkun maneh, you're still allowed to do it because you're doing it l'tzarech lechol nefesh. Lefikach, therefore, we can say another halacha that's very similar. Lefikach muter lishrais b'mayim hamachpedes shemechabdin ba hatanur. Let's say you fired up your brand new oven, and now you want to put the bread in, but you look at the oven and you realize that the oven is a little bit too hot. What you're allowed to do is you have a broom that you use to clean the bottom of the oven. If you remember, we discussed this yesterday. When you have an oven where you bake on the bottom of the oven, you're allowed to sweep out the floor of the oven in order to do your baking. So you have your sweeping broom over there at the ready. You notice that the oven is a little bit too hot. You could take the sweeping broom, dunk it in cold water, insert it into the oven, and sweep out the oven, which is going to have the dual effect of cleaning the floor of the oven and cooling down the oven. You're allowed to do that, says the Mechaber. Therefore, mutar lishrais b'mayim hamachbedes. You're allowed to soak in water the broom shabachabdin ba tanor that you use to sweep out the tanor. Afal pi shamechabe. Even though by doing this, you are also going to extinguish some burning embers on the floor of the oven. So the Mechaber is comparing these two halachas. You're allowed to pour cold water on the fired up oven, even though you're going to do makeh b'patish and you're going to strengthen the oven. You're allowed to do it because you're doing it l'tzarech eichel nefesh. So too, if you need to cool down the oven, you could sweep out the oven with a wet broom, even though you're also going to be performing the malacha of mechabe. You're going to extinguish burning embers on the floor of the oven. Again, because you're doing it l'tzarech eichel nefesh. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut and lamed aleph. Lefikach, therefore, Ritzayin Eloymar. What the Mechaber wants to say over here is, if the oven is hotter than necessary, and you're concerned that lest the bread become burned, you're allowed to soak the sweeping broom in water in order to then sweep out the oven with the cold, wet broom in order to cool down the oven. And you're doing this also for the dual purpose of sweeping out the small burning embers that might be left out after the first sweeping of the oven that you did, which removed all of the large coals. Now there still might be some small burning cinders or embers. So when you sweep out the oven with the wet broom, you're going to accomplish two things. You're going to cool down the oven somewhat, and you're also going to sweep out these burning embers, which is kibui. V'chol zeh shari, and this is still mutar, afal pi shemechabe, even though you're performing the malacha of mechabe, of extinguishing. Kevan shehu tzarech eichel nefesh, this is mutar, because you're doing it l'tzarech eichel nefesh. Now the Chavetz Chaim notes, Kavar Kasavnu, I already wrote earlier in Sivkat L'chav Gimel, Dibazeh, with that in this case, and as well as in the case where you're cooling down the oven with cold water, this is only mutter if you're doing it, because if you do not do it, the pas that you try to bake in the oven will become ruined. But if the bread will not become ruined, rather it'll just become slightly singed, so it won't be pretty, then aser. Then you're not allowed to do this. Then you're not allowed to do the malacha of kibui. You're not allowed to extinguish burning embers. You're also not allowed to perform tikkun maneh by pouring the cold water on the oven. If you're only doing it so that the bread should be pretty, that's not a davar hashaveh l'chol nefesh. Not everybody needs pretty bread. So that's not called something that you're doing so l'tzarech eichel nefesh, that's mutar on Yom Tov. Only if the bread is going to become ruined. You wouldn't be allowed to do this because it's the malacha of mechabe. The kasra paiskim, the paiskim write, after you sweep out the oven. Let's say it was a case where it was mutter for you to sweep out the oven. So you swept out the oven and you swept out some burning embers. Now you may have burning embers on the end of the broom. Also, now you're not allowed to dunk the broom head into a bucket of water. You swept out the oven floor and you swept up some burning embers, which was mutter, because you did it l'tzarech eichel nefesh. But now you have a problem. Now you have burning embers on the tip of your broom and you're afraid your broom is going to burn. So now you want to take it, you want to dunk it in water, or you want to beat it on the floor to put out the embers. That you're not allowed to do. Because now you're doing kibui, you're extinguishing those embers, but you're not doing it l'tzarech eichel nefesh. It has nothing to do with the bread that's in the oven. This is true even though you might need the broom because you're still baking today. So you need the broom. It's one of your baking implements. So you'll say to yourself, okay, maybe that's tzarech eichel nefesh. No, it's not. Maybe it's machshirei eichel nefesh, but it's not eichel nefesh. Even though if it was machshirei eichel nefesh, it would be mutter because it would be machshirei eichel nefesh she'ef shalasos from Erev Yom Tov. So I guess it's not even called machshirei eichel nefesh. Okay, just thought of that now. Okay, Sif Vav. 3 lines from the bottom in the Mechaber. Mutter le'efais tanur mole pas. You're allowed to bake a full oven's worth of bread. Aval pi she'enoi tzarech ela pas echad. Even if it could be that you only need 1 challah. Still in all, you're allowed to bake a full oven's worth of bread. Now that's very similar to a halacha that we saw earlier, even though we're going to see in the Mishnah Berurah that there may potentially be a difference between the 2 halachas. We learned earlier that you're allowed to make a full pot of stew, even if you only need 1 piece of meat. You're allowed to take out an 18-quart pot and cook up 12 pounds of meat, even though you only need 2 pieces of meat. Why? So we said because it's 1 tircha. Making 1 stew is 1 pot of stew is considered 1 tircha, and all of the meat that's in the pot tastes better because you have a richer stew when you have more meat. So it's only a tircha echad, and there's a benefit to Yom Tov because the meat that you eat on Yom Tov is going to taste better. Similarly, over here, the Mechaber says you're allowed to bake a full oven of challah even though you only need 1 challah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton lamed beis, and here's where we're going to see some differences maybe between these 2 halachas. Tanur mole pas, you could bake a full oven of bread. Ava pi she'enoi tzarech, even if you only need 1 challah. Yesh min ha-poskim. There are those poskim she'soivrin who hold dafka b'miskaven she'al yedei zeh yoshbach hapas. This halacha is only true if your das is that I'm baking a full oven of bread because it's going to improve the quality of all the bread, and therefore the quality of the Yom Tov bread will be improved. But if your intent is, hey, I'm baking, I need 1 challah, I might as well make a whole batch of 10 challahs so that I'll have challah left over for after Yom Tov, aser, that's aser. Now, even though earlier in Tav Kuf Gimel Sif Aleph we saw Le'inyan milui kedera basar, when it comes to filling up a pot of meat, afilu oisel tzarech chayil shari, it's mutter to make a large pot of beef stew, even if you clearly have kavana that I'm going to eat this stew during the week. It's still mutter mipnei shal yedei zeh mishtabeach habasar shetzarech liyom tov. It's still mutter because the Yom Tov meat is going to taste better because it's part of a richer stew. So over there by the pot, we don't say that your intent has to be in order to improve the Yom Tov stew. Over there it's mutter, even if your intent is that you should have leftover beef stew for the rest of the week. What's the difference? It explains the Chavetz Chaim, Shani Hasam, over there it's different, the Chad Tirchahu, because by the pot of beef stew, putting up 1 pot of stew, that's called a tircha chada. That's called 1 act of exertion. I'm putting up a pot of stew. Somebody asks you, what are you making for Yom Tov? I'm putting up a pot of stew. That's what you say, whether you're using a 2-quart pot, a 6-quart pot, an 8-quart pot, or an 18-quart pot. You say, I'm putting up a pot of stew. So putting up a pot of stew is chad tircha. That's 1 tircha. So you're doing 1 tircha, and Yom Tov is going to benefit from it because all the meat that you eat on Yom Tov is going to taste better. That's okay. Aval hacha, but over here when you're baking challah, that's not called making 1 challah or 2 challahs or 10 challahs are not called tircha chad. That's called 10 different tirchas. Aval hacha kol kikar tzarech tircha b'fnei atzmai. Each bread you're metapel with on its own. When you make 10 challahs, you have to braid 10 challahs, right? You mold and shape 10 challahs, and you put each challah into the oven individually. When you make a pot of stew, you're not metapel with each piece of meat on its own. You take a bunch of meat, you throw it in. Now it's true, it might take you more than 1 act of throwing it in. But we don't look at each piece of meat as being a separate tircha. It's 1 pot of stew. But each challah is a separate tircha. you must handle each challah individually. And you have to put each challah in the oven, and you have to take each challah out of the oven. So that's not called chad tircha. That's called multiple tirchas. And therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah over there, while it's true that all the bread is going to be higher quality because you're going to have a lot of bread in the oven, but you need both ingredients. You need it to be chad tircha, and you need it to be that everything is going to be improved, that the Yom Tov meat or challah is going to be improved. Then it's okay, even if you do it al das, to have leftovers during the week. But in our case of the challah, where you only have one ingredient, the only ingredient that you have is that the Yom Tov challah is going to be higher quality because you filled up the oven. But you have to do multiple tirchas. In that case, you're only allowed to do it if your intent in the other tircha is to improve the Yom Tov challah. Then you're allowed to do it. But if your intent is to have leftovers during the week, then you're not allowed to do it. Says the Mechaber Weiter, 2 lines from the bottom in the middle. This halacha, that you're allowed to bake an oven full of bread, even if you only need one challah, says the Mechaber, the dafka b'tanu reihem. That was only true in the type of ovens that they had in those days in the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara. Shahayu kitanim, those ovens were small. Vahayu medabkim apas b'daf noisehem, and they used to attach the breads to the side walls of the oven. And when you would fill up an oven of bread, because the oven is full and surrounded with bread, there's no room for the heat to escape the oven. And therefore the bread would be baked more thoroughly, and it would improve the quality of the bread. You have a small oven, and the whole surround of the oven is full of bread because you're sticking loaves of bread to the side walls of the oven. So in the whole height of the oven, the height of the oven is choked off by breads all over the walls of the oven. Now the heat of the oven can't escape, and that has the effect of improving the quality of the bread. Excuse me. Aval betanurim shalanu. But with our ovens, says the Mechaber, with the type of ovens that they had in the days of the Mechaber, where it was a large oven and you baked on the floor of the oven, in that case, the Mechaber said you can't bake more than what you need because there is no improvement to the Yom Tov bread by filling up the oven with bread. So then you have no excuse to bake extra bread. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to be mitzamtzim and you have to figure out exactly how many slices of challah you need for Yom Tov. As long as you're baking something that you have a reasonable expectation that you might need on Yom Tov, that's fine. But to bake above and beyond what you know, I know I'm not going to use 1 or 2 challahs. So then to go bake a dozen challahs, you have no heter, because there's no improvement in the quality of the Yom Tov challahs by filling up the oven. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Lamid Gimel, they had small ovens and they would stick the loaves of bread onto the walls of the oven. And if in places where that was never the way of baking bread, where they never stuck the loaves on the sides of the oven, they only put them on the floor, gadol the cotton shovel iser. Then it's immaterial whether it's a large oven or a big or a small oven. If you're baking on the floor of the oven, then somehow filling up the oven does not improve the quality of the bread. It's only when you're baking on the side walls of the oven. Aval betanurim shaladu is cotton lamadalit. Hatam, the reason why the Mechaber says that in the ovens that they had in those days, there's no improvement in the quality of the bread. Mishum shebachol kikar kikar ikatercha ba'aricha va'afia. The reason why the Mechaber says in the types of ovens they have, you're only allowed to bake what you need. The reason is twofold. First of all, each kikar, each loaf of challah that you made is going to be a separate tircha, like we explained before. You have to do a separate aricha. You have to braid each loaf va'afia, and you bake each loaf independently. You put it in the oven and take it out of the oven. And therefore, you're not allowed to bake extra unless there's a distinct improvement in the Yom Tov challah by the fact that you filled up the oven. And this would be also to bake extra even through the agency of a non-Jew. Therefore, you're not allowed to break extra challah. There are those paiskim that are matir baking extra loaves even in our kinds of ovens. Now, realize, says the Chavetz Chaim, that the whole basis for such a heter to bake extra on Yom Tov, you zicher have to at least need one challah. If you need to bake at least one challah for Yom Tov, so then there's room for a heter to bake extra challah above and beyond what you need if there's going to be an improvement to the Yom Tov challah by filling up the oven. If you don't need challah at all on Yom Tov, and rather what you're doing is you're using ha'arama. You're saying, I'm going to go bake a challah, and I'll eat a little bit of the fresh challah on Yom Tov to allow me to bake. Then it's definitely also to bake extra. In a pressing circumstance, for example, somebody forgot to make an erev tavshilin when Shabbos falls out right after Yom Tov. And he needs pashat challah for Shabbos. And now he has no heter to bake on Yom Tov for Shabbos because he forgot to make an erev tavshilin. Then you could rely on this opinion to bake on Yom Tov before the morning Suda. So if you forgot to make an erev tavshilin, and today is Friday and it's Yom Tov, and you don't have challah for Shabbos, so what you could do is bake a batch of fresh challah on Friday Yom Tov before the Friday morning Suda, and have fresh challah for the Friday morning Suda, then bake extra for Shabbos. But if you don't need challah at all, you have no excuse to bake for Yom Tov. You have 20 challahs, and you're not going to appreciate having fresh challah. So if you have no excuse to bake at all, rather you just say, I'm going to bake and I'll eat a kazayas of challah to be matir the afiyah. Also, Shabbos, that it would be also, even though you might be doing it for Shabbos' sake. And the commercial bakers, who their intent is that they want to do their baking through the agency of a non-Jew on Yom Tov. This guy has a bagel store, and he wants to be able to make bagels on Yom Tov because he knows Matzah Yom Tov, there's going to be a run on bagels. So he wants to bring in Goyim on Yom Tov to bake fresh bagels on Yom Tov. And the excuse that he has for baking 25 dozen bagels is he calls in his non-Jewish staff and he says, go bake 100 dozen bagels and bring me one fresh bagel and I'll eat it for my morning Suda. Oisin Isser L'Kulei Alma. The Chavetz Chaim says everybody would agree that is usher, that is forbidden. Says the Mechaber Sif Zayin. This is a catchy little sif over here. It's a very technically awkward sif. If you note, there are some very large beer halachas over here due to the background of the halacha and the way the Mechaber wrote it in a very interesting fashion. He seems to be pulling certain parts of what he writes from the Rambam, certain parts from Rashi, and he's like walking a tightrope between the Rambam and Rashi, and he's being choshish for the Rambam's concerns and the Rashi's concerns. If somebody wants to look at it, the bir halachas over here are very, very interesting, but they're beyond the scope of the shir in its present format. But I will try to give some background. So says the Mechaber, Mutter listoim pi hatanor, you're allowed to seal up the opening of the oven. Let's remember that we are spoiled, and in our modern GE, Maytag, Genair, etc. ovens, all of our ovens have a gasket. And we fire up our oven and we close the door, and the heat is not escaping through the oven door because there is a gasket. Their ovens did not have gaskets. So what they needed to do was they needed to create a seal. The way they would do that is they would put whatever they were putting in the oven, and then they would take mud and they would use mud to seal up around the oven door. That was their gasket. Therefore, it says the Mechaber, Mutter listaim pi hatanur. It is permissible to seal up the opening of the oven, betit varefesh, using mud or refesh is another form of mud. I don't know if you would call it muck or slime, various degrees of moisture, I would assume, of mud. You're allowed to seal up the opening of the oven with mud, sha'al svas hanahar, if it's mud that you found on the riverbank. Now, why is the Mechaber telling me that the mud is located on the riverbank? We will see that, of course, every word of Torah, there's never, these are the words of Rishonim. There's nothing here that's extra. The Mechaber wrote this for a specific reason. So you're allowed to take mud from the riverbank and use it to seal up the oven. So let's dive right away into the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, kan lamid vav mutter listaim piatanor. It's permissible to seal up the opening of the oven. Kigain erev Shabbos shechal b'Yom Tov. Let's say Yom Tov fell out on Friday. Tomorrow is Shabbos, and you want to have your hat cholent for Shabbos. Shetzarich lahatmin hatavshilin lamachar. So you need to put your chamin, you need to put your cholent or your jachnun, you need to put your chamin into the oven and insulate it so it should stay hot for Shabbos. And that's why you're sealing up the oven. Or b'Yom Tov gufa, or maybe you're doing this for Yom Tov itself. You want to retain as much heat in the oven as possible so that whatever you're making inside the oven should roast and cook very thoroughly. And that's why you're seeking to seal the oven door. So the Mechaber said you're allowed to do this petit varefesh sha'al svas nohar. You're allowed to use the mud or the muck that was taken from the riverbanks. Why the riverbanks? Says the Chavetz Chaim, shemipnei roiv hamayim, since on the riverbank there's a lot of water, and the earth on the bank of the river is always getting soaked and always getting wet. Matzoi shehem mirukachim. Therefore, the mud is already very moist and very, very wet, and it's already muddy. Ve'enam tzrichem gibel, and you're not required. I shouldn't use the word need over here. You're not required to knead with a K, to knead the earth and the water into a mud that you could then use to smear around the oven opening to use as a seal. So the point that the Mechaber is making, that you're taking the mud from the riverbank, is that there are multiple problems. There are multiple malacha problems that we have over here in the act of taking mud to seal up the oven door. One of them is the problem of lush. Lush is kneading. Kneading with a K is a malacha. Now, how do you make mud? You take earth and water and you knead them together to make a mud that you could smear around. That would be the isser of lush. Lush is mutter l'tzarech eichel nefesh, but not if it's something that you could have done on Erev Yom Tov. If you want to knead mud to seal up your oven door, that's machshirei eichel nefesh. It's a preparatory step for eichel nefesh that you could have done on Erev Yom Tov. You could have kneaded up a bowl full of mud on Erev Yom Tov, so you should have it ready to seal the oven door. So you're not allowed to do that gibel, that act of kneading the mud on Yom Tov. Therefore, the Mechaber says he's talking about mud that was already muddy. It was already kneaded into mud because it's on the riverbank. So that takes care of one of the malacha issues. But now there's another malacha issue. The other malacha issue is you're now going to take this mud and you're going to smear it around the opening of the oven. That's meruach. That's the isser of smearing something, smoothing something out on Shabbos or Yom Tov, like taking Vaseline and smearing it on your skin. That's meruach. Meruach is also a malacha. Says the Chavetz Chaim, v'afal gav to become makayim, even though, nevertheless, besides the point that you found this mud already kneaded into mud on the riverbank, tzarich lemerayach leisam al gabe atanor b'shastima, you still need to do meruach to smear it around the oven opening on Yom Tov. U'mimareach gam ken av malachahi, and mimareach is an av malacha. Meruach shani. The malacha of meruach is different than the malacha of lush. The malacha of lush, we had no way to be matir, because the malacha of lush, that's machshirei yochel nefesh, that you could have done before Yom Tov. So we can't be matir that on Yom Tov. But meruach shani, this meruach is different. You could not have done it on Erev Yom Tov. You just put the food into the oven on Yom Tov. So you couldn't have smeared, you can't seal the oven before Yom Tov. You got to put the food in first. And you put the food in on Yom Tov. So the miruach is something that you couldn't do before Yom Tov. And therefore, a mutter l'tzarech achila. So that's mutter l'tzarech oichel nefesh. So now, what has the Mechaber said so far here in Siv Zayin? So far, what the Mechaber has told me is, you want to seal your oven opening on Yom Tov, you could go to the riverbank, you could take mud that was already naturally kneaded into mud, so it doesn't need any gibel, it doesn't need any lush. You could take it and you could do meruach, you could smear it around the opening of your oven, because meruach is mutter on Yom Tov l'tzarech oichel nefesh, because you could not have done it on Erev Yom Tov. Okay, very good. Now continues the Mechaber. V'hu sherikechai me'emesh. This is only true if you needed the mud, needed with a K, if you needed the mud yesterday. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to point out right away that the lashon of the Mechaber over here seems to be very imprecise. The Mechaber just told me that I'm only allowed to do this if I took mud that was already needed, because I found it by the riverbank. Now he's telling me that this is only true if you needed it yesterday. What do you mean I needed it yesterday? I didn't need it at all. I took it from the riverbank already needed. So it seems that the Mechaber over here he's now addressing a separate problem. And the separate problem is the problem of muktzah. We know that you're not allowed to handle anything on Yom Tov unless it's a muchan. If it's muktzah, you're not allowed to handle it. So muktzah, the Rambam is concerned with muktzah. This mud, why isn't it muktzah? So what he's saying over here is, I'm sorry, just 1 second. Yeah, what he's saying over here is, V'hu sherikechai me'emesh, I asa by Siman. There's two ways that you could get around the muktzah problem. What are the ways that you can get around the muktzah problem? Well, if you're dealing with mud that you found by the riverbank, so now I have no problem of lush at all, but I still have a potential problem of muktzah. So then the Mechaber says you have two ways out of the muktzah problem. One is if you're dealing with mud from the riverbank, asa by Siman. You go to that mud on the riverbank and you make a siman on it. Yeah, I don't know, you push your finger in it, you make a funny design, and you make a siman that says, this is the mud that I am preparing, I'm being making it for Yom Tov use to seal up my oven. That would take care of the muktzah problem. But there's another way to take care of the muktzah problem. The other way to take care of the muktzah problem and to take care of the lisha problem also, if you don't live near a river, it's very nice to tell me that you're going to take mud from the riverbank. What if I don't live near the river? Well, then what you could do is you could prepare mud yesterday. Prepare mud on Erev Yom Tov. So now you don't have a problem of lisha because it's already needed. Guess what? You also don't have a problem of muktzah, because the act of kneading the mud on Erev Yom Tov is an act of hachana. So now it's muchan. So according to the way I'm understanding the Mechaber, what you have over here is a collection of halachas like this. First of all, you want to seal up your oven, you could use mud from the riverbank. If there's mud from the riverbank, you have no lisha problem. And meruach is mutter, because meruach, you're doing it l'tzarech oichel nefesh, and you couldn't have done it yesterday. Now, what if you don't live by a riverbank? Well, then you could knead mud on Erev Yom Tov. Now, there's also a muktzah problem. How do you get rid of the muktzah problem? Well, if you live by the riverbank, so you're going to take mud from the riverbank, go to the riverbank, make a siman on the mud. That's an act of hachana. Now it's not muktzah. If you don't live by the riverbank, then you don't have to make a siman, because then you're going to prepare the mud on Erev Yom Tov. And the act of preparing the mud on Erev Yom Tov is the act of hachana that renders the mud not muktzah. And now one more halacha, says the Mechaber, v'nitkai litzad acher. If you're taking the mud from the riverbank, then you have to remove it from the ground on Erev Yom Tov, so that on Yom Tov, when you come to scoop it up, you don't make a hole, make a depression in the ground. That would be a problem of Baina, either a problem of Baina or a problem of Chayresh, and that's only a preparatory step. That's only Mashirei Eichel Nefesh. And that you could have done on Erev Yom Tov, and that's not mutter. So you see over here, there's multiple issues. There's the issue of Lush, there's the issue of Meruach, there's the issue of Muktzah, and there's the issue of Chayrish or Baina. So you have 4 different potential problems, and the Mechaber is telling you in this line over here how to get rid of all of the potential problems. Now let's see the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah says over here, the Mechaber wrote that this is only true if you prepared the mud, if you softened up and kneaded the mud yesterday. Says the Chavetz Chaim Lashon Megumgum. The Lashon of the Mechaber seems to be very imprecise. The Ha'irinon b'merukach. What do you mean? We opened up Siv Zion saying that we're taking the mud from the riverbank, and that's why there's no Lisha problem, because it's already merukach, it's already kneaded. So you're taking it from the riverbank. So why is the Mechaber now telling me that this is only true if you kneaded it yesterday? You didn't have to knead it yesterday. You took it from the riverbank. And if you look through the Biur Halachos, the answer is like I explained it to you. He's talking about 2 different cases. If you take it from the riverbank, fine. But there's another case where you don't live near the river. In that case, you went ahead and you needed it yesterday. Or you made a siman. What do you mean, or you made a siman? Mishum hachana. The point of making the siman is to take away the muktzah problem. Now, I explained to you, what does the Mechaber mean, oy, asa by siman, or you made a siman? He's referring to 2 different cases. If you live not near the river, so you needed the mud Erev Yom Tov, that alone was an act of hachana. Then you don't have to make a siman. Or if you live by the riverbank, so you took the mud from the riverbank, then you have to make a siman because you didn't do an act of hachana on Erev Yom Tov. So you have to make a siman on Erev Yom Tov. That's your act of hachana. You have to scoop up the mud from the riverbank and put it aside. Because if you don't do that before Yom Tov, then you're going to make a guma. You're going to make a hole, which would be a problem of baina or chayrish. If you have mud laying outside on the street, not on the ground, so that they're already detached from the ground, das Magen Avram, the opinion of the Magen Avram is, shein tzarich shum siman v'nituk. Then you don't have to make a siman and you don't have to remove it. Just you have to have on your mind that you're using that mud to seal up your oven. But the lavush implies that there's no difference. Even if you found it in the street, you also have to do an act of achana. I'm just realizing now also that the nitkai l'tzad acher also belies the need for making a siman. If you scoop up the mud and put it aside, you don't have to make a siman, because that's also an act of hachana. I've cut mem aleph. Oh no, now we got to finish off the Mechaber here. I know we're going a little bit long, but I want to finish this page and finish the siman. Continues the Mechaber on the bottom line near the end. Aval gabel tit be Yom Tov aser, but to knead mud on Yom Tov, that's forbidden, because that would be lush. However, you are allowed to knead ash and water together to make it into a paste to seal up your oven. That you're allowed to do even on Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cotton mem aleph on kuf chav daled amud aleph. Aval gabel, but to knead mud on Yom Tov is aser. Yesha kasver, there are those that write hatam that the reason for this is the gibel zel listam ataner, because kneading mud in order to seal up an oven, hurak machshirei oichel nefesh. That's only a preparatory step of oichel nefesh. Sheina mutter, which is not permissible on Yom Tov if it's a malacha, rak be'i efshel asoisem erev Yom Tov. Only if it couldn't have been done on erev Yom Tov. V'hacha, and in this case, haloi efshel hayol legabloi mikayim. You could have kneaded and prepared your mud already on erev Yom Tov, so we're not going to be matter that on Yom Tov. Well, if he times that according to this rationale, yesh bazeh iser Torah, to do it on Yom Tov would be an iser daraisa. You're doing the malacha of lush on Yom Tov, and it's only machshirei achal nefesh, and you could have done it on every Yom Tov. That's an iser daraisa. V'yesha kasu, however, there are those that write the list of ataner kadesha yispashel, that to seal up an oven in order to be able to cook, ay kadesha yitztamek hamaychel, also that the food in the oven should cook well. Mikri eichel nefesh kufei, that's considered actual eichel nefesh, not machshirei eichel nefesh, kehavara, just like lighting up a fire. So in that case, why is it aser? If it's mamish tzarich eichel nefesh, so then it should be mutter. Nevertheless, aser kachamim, the Chazal aser this mishum the yomer the megabel opinion, because when somebody sees you with a bucket kneading mud, that looks like you're preparing a wall. It looks like you're getting ready to make cement. That doesn't look like gibul tzarich eichel nefesh. Ice cotton membez. The lashon of the mechaber was that you're not allowed to be megabel tit. You're not allowed to knead mud. V'hu adin afar. I'm not sure what the difference over here is between tit and afar. Tit is mud, which is a combination of earth and water. He says over here, the Chavetz Chaim, you're allowed to knead mud. You're also allowed to knead dirt. The only thing I could think of is that he's talking about two different degrees of moisture. One is you have tit, which is already muddy, but it's not kneaded yet into a paste that you could use to close up your oven. Afar is you have mamish dry afar. So he's telling you not only are you not allowed to knead mud, you're not allowed to knead dirt into mud either. The bar gibelhu. I hope I'm not missing something, but not sure. Ice cotton mem gimel on kov chavdal and beis umuto legabel efer. However, it is permissible to use ash, to knead ash together with water to make a paste. That is mutter. Loy mebaya. This there's no need to say this. Laman da Amar, according to the opinion in Gemara Shabbos Yudches Amud Aleph, she'ein chayavim b'Shabbos al gibel efer, who holds that there's no isser of kneading ash together with water on Shabbos, mishum de'ein mistabek al yedei gibel, because ash does not combine with water truly. It doesn't absorb the water and really form one gush, one paste. That's not the ash and the water remain distinct. So then bevadai shari, then this is certainly mutter. Even according to the opinion that holds that even with something like ash, which doesn't really combine, kigon be'efer like ash, mishosh nothing by mayim chayiv. Still, when you add water to ash, you're chayiv. Mikamokim hacha mutter. Still over here to use it to seal up your oven on Yom Tov would be mutter. Tahal l'tzarich eichel nefeshu, because this would be we would be mater l'tzarich eichel nefesh. Ushnei taimim de la'el, and the two rationales that we gave earlier for this iser loy shaychi gabi efer don't apply to ash. Shaharei me'erev Yom Tov loy haya efshaloi legabel. First of all, if what you're using to seal up your oven is a paste made out of water and ash, you can't prepare that on Erev Yom Tov, because since it doesn't absorb the water, it's not going to remain a paste. She'efer eina machzik mayim. It doesn't hold the water, and therefore the ash just dries out again and falls apart, so it doesn't remain a paste. The tam sheni, and as far as the second rationale that we gave, that it might look like you're preparing a binyan, the tam sheni the mechzik megabel a binyan, gam ken lo shaychi befer. That also doesn't apply to ash. Shein megabel nefer lebinyan, because nobody makes cement out of ash. So everybody would realize you're doing it for the purpose of your oven. Nevertheless, if somebody has mud already prepared from Erev Yom Tov, also the Gabel Efer B'Yom Tov, he certainly should not need water and ash together to use it on Yom Tov if he has mud that he could use. There are those who write that we should be stringent B'Gibel Efer B'Yom Tov when it comes to needing even ash and water on Yom Tov. Even though the Ikra Din says the Chavetz Chaim is not like that opinion, and of course, when we talk about the concept of a heter, of kneading ash with water on Yom Tov, we must be talking about ash that was already burnt from before Yom Tov. Deina muktzah, so it's not muktzah. But ash that was only generated through a fire on Yom Tov is muktzah because it's noilad ugedalael siman tav tzal ches sif tes vav. And Baruch Hashem, now we're back up to the Dirshu schedule. Thank you for bearing with me for going a little bit over time. Thank you for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should stand God's Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rabbi Shem should be Megan and God's Klal Yisrael. The schus of limud HaTorah should serve as a schus for Refuah Shalema for Nachum Meir ben Yehudis Chaika, and the Rabbi Shem should protect everyone. We should all have a ksiva tova, a good kibben shkiar, and Mirza Hashem. I'll see you tomorrow. Be well.